Thank you for joining. We will begin shortly. Thank you for joining us. Please enjoy the event.
Welcome. I'm Stefan Redding Lallinger, and I'm the Executive Director of Next 100, a policy think tank that centers the voices and research of those directly impacted by the policy issues they work on. During today's event, we will discuss the findings of our national survey conducted over the summer about government and democracy, with a specific focus on the attitudes of young people and people of color towards these issues. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. Please note that this event is being recorded and live streamed. Secondly, for each panelist, before speaking for the first time, please give a visual introduction of yourself for any visually impaired audience members. For example, my name is Stefan. I have curly hair and a salmon-colored shirt against the backdrop of a New York City office window. We're going to kick today off with a 10-minute presentation of the findings from the summer survey, followed by a panel discussion that I'll moderate featuring Dr. Tabitha Decker, Dr. Kathy Cohen, Nia Johnson, and Chantal Hines. If you'd like to submit a question for our panelists, please do so using the chat feature. I'll introduce our panelists more fully once we get to the panel portion of our event. For now, I'd like to introduce Tabitha Decker. Tabitha is the Deputy Director at Next 100 and has researched, written about, and led advocacy campaigns on improving transportation as a means of advancing racial, gender, and economic equality. She was the lead author of the report that Next 100 published this summer, analyzing the findings from a national survey of attitudes about democracy and government called Young Adults Think America's Political System Isn't Working. This was a follow-up to a previous survey and report Next 100 completed 2 years ago about young people's attitudes toward government. Of course, in the past 4 years, we've had a presidential election with record turnout in 2020, followed by a disgraceful and violent attempt to overturn the results of that election. And of course, we find ourselves 3 weeks from another consequential national election. So this event could not be more timely. Without further ado, I will pass it to Tabitha Decker to go over the findings from this summer's survey. Tabitha?
Thank you, Stefan, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. As Stefan mentioned, I'm Tabitha Decker. I'm the Deputy Director at Next 100. I'm a white woman. I'm wearing a black shirt, and I've got one of those kind of blurry Zoom backgrounds behind me. So yes, Election Day is just 3 weeks away, and the polls suggest that this will be a historically close election. One group to watch is young adults. In 2020, a surge of young adult voters, including record numbers of young adult voters of color, partly drove an election turnout that was higher than it had been in decades, and they helped to elect Joe Biden. Generations like millennials and Gen Z are becoming a center of power demographically. Millennials are the largest living adult generation, and they're the largest generation currently in the workforce. Together with Gen Z, they're the most racially and ethnically diverse generations in the history of this country. So in addition to their importance in shaping the outcome of the election next month, they represent the present and the future of our pluralistic multiracial democracy. It was in this context that this May, Next 100 and Gen Forward partnered on a survey that was focused on young adults defined as people between the ages of 18 and 40. We were curious about their civic engagement and their political participation, their trust in government and government leaders, and their views on the state of our democracy and its potential to be an effective political system. So I'm going to share key findings that are specifically from the section of the survey about democracy, and we will get into some of the other findings about civic engagement, for example, during our panel discussion. Another thing I want to point out at the top is that Gen Forward's approach is to oversample people of color. This gives us the great ability to look into differences and similarities across race, and also to delve into some intersectional categories, for example, gender and race together. And I will be highlighting where we saw notable differences based on identity. Next slide, please. So about a quarter of young adults in the US think democracy is working well. I think we might have set the bar a little bit high by using the phrase working well, but it's nonetheless a troubling finding. Here, we saw relatively little variation across groups. Women, for example, were a bit less likely to say that democracy was working well than men, and more Asian American, Pacific Islander young adults think that democracy is working well than white, Black, or Latinx young adults. Next slide. 61% of young adults say that they're concerned about the future of our democracy, and only 1 in 10 young adults say that they are not concerned. Here, we did see a bit more demographic variation. There were more white and AAPI respondents who were concerned than there were Latinx and Black young adult respondents who expressed concern about democracy. Likewise, respondents with household incomes of above $60,000 were more likely to express concern than those with lower household incomes. And when we looked at gender and race together, and this is not included in the figure, white women expressed concern at higher levels than AAPI, Black, and Latinas. Next slide, please. Roughly half of young adults believe in democracy's potential to be an effective form of government. That belief was highest among the same groups that expressed the most concern about democracy's future. So AAPI young adults and white young adults were more concerned than adults of other races, and those with household incomes of above $60,000 were more concerned. Looking at race and gender together, which is again not included in the figure, we saw the lowest levels of belief in the potential of democracy among Black women, Latinas, and among Black men. The fact that Black, Latinx, and lower income young adults have lower levels of belief in the potential of our democracy to be effective may help explain why fewer members of those groups were concerned about democracy's future. Next slide, please. That young adults from some marginalized groups are more ambivalent or skeptical about democracy's potential makes sense in the context of one of our most concerning findings. When asked if they feel that they have the full and equal rights and protections that others have in this country, we found significant disagreement with that statement from respondents who were Black, who had incomes of under $60,000 a year, and from women. And then looking at race and gender together, which is again not included in the figure, we found that Black women and Latinas were more likely to disagree that they had full and equal rights compared with white women and AAPI women. Lower likelihood in the potential of our democracy is likely based on the experience of marginalization, of racism, of sexism, of economic precarity, and then we especially saw that to be the case in some groups that faced multiple forms of marginalization. Next slide, please. When asked, what is the greatest issue facing your community? Economic issues were front of mind for young adults. The number one answer was economic growth, followed by income inequality, poverty, homelessness, and high taxes. Here, there was some variation based on race in what respondents cited as the greatest issue facing their community. Gun violence, for example, rose to the top for Black young adults, and crime made the top 5 for Black, Latinx, and AAPI young adults. Next slide, please. We also asked respondents, what is needed for a functioning democracy? And here, the top 5 responses were free and fair elections, equal access to education and information, limiting the influence of money in politics, equal protection under the law, and housing and food affordability. Here, there was also some variation among demographic groups on priority issues. For example, housing and food affordability was the second priority issue for Black young adults and for young people with household incomes under $60,000. And taking a step back, if these are some of the things that young adults see as foundational to a well-working democracy, is it really a surprise that few think that our democracy is working well? Yes, this election is a critical moment for our country, and regardless of its outcome, we have major challenges to address in realizing a political system that serves our ideals of liberty and justice for all, and in realizing a fair and just distribution of our resources. So I'm looking forward to our discussion today about what to make of these results and what the possible paths forward are. I also want to say that I've just shared a small number of our findings. And so if you're interested in learning more about this report, please take a look. And I believe that we have a link in the chat now. So I'll turn it back to Stefan.
Thank you so much, Tabitha, and thank you for that wonderful framing and teeing up of this conversation. As you mentioned, there's a much fuller accounting of the results available in the report, for which Tabitha was the lead author alongside Dr. Kathy Cohen, who I'm about to introduce, and Chantal Hines here. So without further ado, let's get to our panel. I've already introduced Tabitha. Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Kathy Cohen. Dr. Kathy J. Cohen is the D. Gale Johnson Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago. She currently serves as the inaugural chair of the Department of Race, Diaspora, and Indigeneity at the University of Chicago. She's also the founder and director of the Black Youth Project. She's written several books and is the founder of Gen Forward. Next, I'd like to introduce Chantal Hines. Chantal is a senior policy entrepreneur at Next 100 and a fellow at the Century Foundation. She is an advocate for students involved in the foster system, working to ensure that they have the educational support they need to succeed. And finally, I'd like to introduce Nia Johnson. Nia is a policy entrepreneur at Next 100, a community organizer, and an advocate for social change. Her current work focuses on corporate oversight initiatives that impact racial equity and worker empowerment. So we've got a power-packed panel for you in limited time to get through a lot of really, really important content. Please remember, if you're in the audience and you have questions, feel free to put those right in the chat, and some of those questions will be passed on to me. We're going to start with some questions of my own. Dr. Cohen, I would love to start with you, just for a little bit of framing and grounding. Tabitha mentioned some of the unique approaches that Gen Forward takes in surveying the public. Dr. Cohen, I was hoping you could tell us a little bit more about why you created Gen Forward and what makes its approach unique.
Sure. First of all, I want to just say I'm Kathy Cohen. I'm a Black woman, have dreadlocks and a black shirt on and behind a bookshelf. I also want to say I'm so thrilled to be here, to be in conversation with all these kind of powerful folks, and to have been in partnership with Next 100. So let me just say a little bit about why Gen Forward and what we do. So Gen Forward was created to kind of amplify the voices of young adults, especially young adults of color. We believe that young people of color kind of receive a disproportionate impact on government policies that are meant to oppress and disinvest largely from communities of color. We believe that because of that existence, it is critical that, in fact, young adults of color are a part of the political community, that part of our political discourse, political decision-making, and that we take their positionality and their sense of what needs to be done seriously. So, along those lines, we built the Gen Forward survey. It's basically a quarterly survey With an oversample of young adults, as Tabitha suggested, it allows us to disaggregate by race, ethnicity, gender, partisanship, age, so that we can look not only across generations, but within a generation. It's regularly scheduled so we can be kind of current and topical. And again, it is important for us to kind of root the experiences of young adults in the questions we ask. The last thing I'll say is that we see this work as kind of participating, supporting, augmenting the work of movement organizations, right? It is meant to talk about not just where young people are, but where they want to go. It's meant to help refine kind of campaigns and organizing strategies, and it's meant to amplify the power and the voices of young folks, in particular, young folks of color.
Thank you for that answer, Dr. Cohen. And I know the organization Next 100 reciprocates the opportunity to partner with you all. It's just such a great partnership. And I think there's a lot of alignment between Gen Forward and Next 100. So Chantal, I'm actually going to turn it over to you to close out this sort of framing about the organizations behind this effort. Can you talk a little bit about how Gen Forward's approach aligns with some of Next 100's core beliefs and its mission?
Sure. Thank you, Stefan. I am also a Black woman with locks and glasses, with a white shirt in front of a white background with some plants on a shelf. Next 100's sort of core value and approach is really empowering, developing leaders of those who are most impacted by the policy decisions that happen in this country. Often, those of us who are most impacted by policy decisions are left out of the policy decision-making process. We are not at the policy table. So Next 100's goal and vision is to empower those leaders, develop those leaders to enter those spaces to make the change that is needed. So very much aligned with the work of Gen Forward, very much aligned with the work of organizers and different movement work, really to advance policy change in a way that is equitable, that considers those who are most impacted, and that puts that policy position forward and first so that it actually makes the change that's needed.
Thank you. And for more on either organization, visit the organization's website. For us, that's thenext100.org. We'll actually put both websites in the chat for folks. This next question is for Dr. Cohen. Dr. Cohen, believe it or not, when we did this survey in May, Joe Biden was the Democratic nominee for president. I know that feels like it was 10 years ago, but in fact, it was only a few months ago. And at that point, about a third of young adults indicated that they plan to vote for someone other than Joe Biden or Donald Trump. Of course, you all at Gen Forward conducted another survey in late July and early August, once Kamala Harris had replaced Joe Biden on the Democratic ticket. Can you give us an update, just a little bit of a sense for how things looked in August in terms of who young adults indicated that they plan to vote for now that the Democratic ticket had sort of switched?
Sure. I mean, I think we'll all remember that, in fact, when Biden was still at the kind of head of the ticket, there was real concern, as you just articulated, Stefan, about young people, and in particular, young Black people, and where they would align. And let's be even more specific. The concern was really about young Black men and their declarations and numbers we hadn't seen before of voting for the Republican candidate. I shouldn't say we hadn't seen before, since the 1960s, right, of voting for the Republican candidate. We then fielded a survey, and the timing was quite interesting, was right after Joe Biden stepped down, but before, I mean, we were in the field as Kamala Harris was finally declared the presidential candidate for the Democratic Party and was at the head of the ticket. So what we're seeing is the movement, not the final destination, the movement of young people towards Kamala Harris. What did we see? We saw an increase in the number, in particular, of young Black people who said that they were going to vote for Kamala Harris at that moment. So it was around 56%. I think it's one of those moments where, in fact, we can really kind of talk about what we get from Gen Forward, our ability to disaggregate not only by race, but also by gender and race. And what we see again is when we break down those numbers, it's really about 67% of young Black women who are moving towards Harris. And I suspect we have data coming out of the field this week that number will be much higher. But again, back in July and August, we still saw about a quarter, about 28% of young Black men saying they were going to vote for Trump. So, and I can say there were about 40% of Latinx men who said they were going to vote for Trump, about 30% of AAPI males, and about 45% of white men. So this issue that, in fact, people have been talking about, that Harris has a kind of Black male problem or a male problem in terms of delivering the vote, is what we were seeing back in July, the beginning of August. We know, in fact, that continues to be an issue, and maybe we'll talk about it later. But the other thing I want to emphasize, because we've talked a lot about, people are talking a lot about Black men, we want to emphasize the way in which Black women have solidified their support around Harris, and the significance of Black women for the Democratic Party always. And sometimes that's made to be invisible, but I want to call that out as we also talk about Black men and men of color and their kind of gravitation towards Trump. And we can talk about why that might be.
Excellent. Well, we'll be sure to pick up that thread. It's something that's on a lot of people's minds, and there's been a lot of ink spilled on that particular topic over the last couple of weeks. Nia, I want to turn to you. So we're 3 weeks out from the election. In our survey, 68% of respondents said they would probably or definitely vote in November. Now, we know just because you tell a pollster that you're probably going to vote in November doesn't actually mean that you will. It's not a great predictor of turnout. What are some of the things you think, Nia, that will actually determine if young people do turn out for this election?
Yes, thank you, Stefan. And to start with, I'll acknowledge that I am also a Black woman with locks and wearing a Black shirt with a gray background. And I would say, coming from a community that hasn't always had its basic needs met, I think one thing we and many like us are looking for is to see how we combat disinformation in politics. I know that a lot of us of a younger generation have shifted towards consuming social media and different variations of that to keep a pulse on what's going on. If you were to search the 2024 election on TikTok right now, one of the first things that are going to come up are some of the clips about people talking about disinformation, not only about the election, but also about what's going on with the hurricane and beyond. And the reason why this plays such an important role is that with the evolution of social media and the prominence of it, we are getting a chance to see more storytelling, more narrative, and more representation of who is impacted by the political decisions that are made. But because this is such a vast platform, and because historically social media companies have not always been made to be accountable or responsible for how misinformation spreads, there is always the risk that people may get the wrong information about what is occurring within the political realm, when they should vote, how they should vote, or even be swayed just based off of perspectives that are put out there. I think another thing that's going to play a role in this election and beyond is the representation and political commentary. I mentioned that the representation on social media is one of the reasons why so many people are engaged with it, is because now there's a platform to give more of us a voice to speak about what we care about. But even beyond that, I think we are looking to see more representation just among who our elected officials are. And it is exciting to see that the political candidates have changed within a mere span of months. But that is also something that people are paying attention on for how that shapes both locally and also on the state level as well, as there is a through line between what's going on the federal level and what's going on beneath it. I think one last thing that people are also going to be focused on is how our real life experiences are conveyed or resonated with among the political messaging we're seeing. Again, coming from a community where basic needs have not always been met, we haven't always had access to grocery stores or hospitals or quality education. We are looking for this messaging to be present in what our political speakers are saying. And if our narratives or our stories aren't spoken to, it may shape the degree to which we feel like our vote will count or matter in shaping the landscape.
Thanks so much for that, Nia. Dr. Cohen, I actually want to follow up with you. So Nia gave us a lot of the factors that young people would be looking for in terms of whether or not to turn out. Do you have any predictions or thoughts about what type of an election this is going to be? Is this going to be a high turnout election? Or are we going to see some, you're not in that business. You just
I'm not in that business, but let me just, can I add, first of all, I want to just say Nia is right on point, and Stefan, I'm sorry if I took over. So, but I do want to say there are things that we know from the literature or the research in political science about what brings people out to vote, right? And many of the things that Nia talked about are spot on, but there's also just kind of engagement and mobilization, for example. Are there organizations out there dedicated to not just thinking about young people, but for example, young people of color or Black young people? Are they registering them? Are they engaging in political education? And then are they mobilizing them on the day of the vote, right? So we know that mobilization matters. We know that a political agenda that speaks to their concerns, not generally, but really speaks to their concerns matters in terms of gathering and gaining people's attention. We know that the structures for voting, right, related to voting, that are either inviting or prohibitive matter. Can you show up on the day of the election and cast a provisional vote that might be counted? Or are you told that if you didn't register 30 days prior, you can't participate in the election, right? And I think there's a general sense, I suspect when we talk about democracy, we'll get to this, about does their, and this is what Nia was talking about, does their participation matter? And is the political system, whether it's the two-party system or electoral voting, responsive to their needs and the issues that matter in their communities? And, you know, I think we're not sure about that last point. We can do something about the other points, right? In particular, investing in a civic and political infrastructure that is meant to mobilize not only young people when it's time to vote, but off cycle around the issues that matter most in their communities. So am I going to predict? I'd say we probably haven't invested enough in a long-term civic infrastructure to engage young people, in particular young people of color. So don't blame young people and young people of color, whoever the candidate is, when you lose, if you haven't done that work, not just around your election, but really about empowering young people over the long haul. Is that,
Well,
I'm not sure that's predictive.
It's as close to a prediction that I think we'll get out of you. Well, thank you for that answer. And I think it ties nicely into the next question, which is, really encouraging people to look beyond just the particular election cycle, right? These are issues we're talking about that are long in the making and that are going to exist long after this election as well. Chantal, I want to ask you, looking beyond this particular election moment, as Tabitha mentioned, one of the things we found in the survey is that only 26% of young adults think our democracy is working well. And only 54% think it even has the potential to be an effective form of government. It's a little bit of a shocking result. It was, at least for me, when I saw it. What changes are needed to make our political system work for young adults? Where do we even begin?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to echo a lot of what Nia and Dr. Cohen have already shared. This idea of, Dr. Cohen used the term responsiveness, I think is critical in terms of really making our government work. How is our government responding to concerns about world events, to concerns about the economy, to concerns about climate? What are the pressing issues that young adults are bringing to the forefront constantly? And are our elected officials, are our candidates really paying attention to those things? Are they recognize those things? Do those things become more than talking points? Do they become actual measures of policy change? I think that is a key component of really moving the needle on that. Because I ask myself the question, right? Why would one participate in a system that doesn't seem to recognize you, no matter how loud you're screaming, no matter how much noise you're making. I mean, I think about years ago, right? The explosion of the Black Lives Matter movement, even if you go back to its inception, right? Many, many years ago, you think about that and, really how far have we come, right? How far do we still need to go? And how long are people going to just keep knocking on the door, believing in a process that is supposed to work and it's clearly not working? So the frustrations that young people feel are valid. They resonate with me. And I think our elected officials and our candidates and the party system, the two-party system we have in general just really needs to begin to reckon with those things, because folks are kind of gonna just fall out, right? And they're not gonna engage. They're not gonna feel like it matters. And then you have those who have concentrated sources of power, then really commanding the conversation and really getting things done, because you have a group of people who feel essentially disenfranchised by the whole system. So I think really being responsive to the things that young people are bringing to the forefront, the things, Nia spoke about social media, the things that are popping up on social media, the protests, the way people are getting involved and speaking up. We really need our electeds to really focus in on that and make it more than a talking point to win a vote, but make it something more about a solution to a problem that people are raising.
Thank you so much for the answer. Do any of our other panelists want to chime in on that particular question? What changes are needed to make our political system work for young adults, and where might we begin with that?
I'll say just a couple quick things, and then others can jump in also, which is I often hear that question, get asked that question. I really appreciated the answer that was just given. I always push back a little and I appreciate that you didn't say, what do we have to do to make the democracy work? Of course, yes, we want a democratic system that works. But I think what we hear in focus groups and what we hear from our data is that, in fact, if we're asking young people about the most effective way to change or to challenge racism, for example, in this country, they don't necessarily believe that the kind of structures of democracy, where it is about voting and representation, let's say, can do that. When we've asked a list of things that you can do, including voting, and we included revolution, right? 1 out of every 5 young Black people said revolution. Now, people may say, oh, that is silliness. But I think what these young people are saying is that the traditional systemic approach to change, incremental change, is not impacting their lives. And so how do we talk about tweaking democracy when young Black people, young people in general, are being killed, when immigrant children are being snatched from their families? Like, can we talk about tweaking democracy to work when we have those types of events that really are also integral part of democracy at this moment? So I guess the question is, how do we begin to reimagine, as Robin Kelley talks about, freedom dreaming, right? Systems that work for those who are most marginalized, where in the communities that have been disinvested. How do we center that conversation? And it probably leads towards changing democracy, but we have to be open to a new vision of how democracy functions beyond the kind of electoral representation. What do young people believe a functioning, a responsive, right, a fair and equal democracy really looks like? And I think they have a broad, expansive vision of what that system might be.
Well, thank you so much for that answer. I think it illuminates this idea that, particularly in Black political thought historically, there's always been a tension between this idea of incremental change and much more fundamental and systemic change, and how you even go about engendering either type of change. So that's really important to call out. I'd love to get Nia in on this question before we move to the next one.
Yeah, I completely agree with what the other panelists stated, and I think the only other thing that I would want to elevate or highlight was just thinking about the role that money plays in politics and in democracy and in particular. And that was one of the things that, based on what respondents were saying, they highlighted as one of the most influential things that could help improve democracy. But if we look beyond democracy, we understand that the role of money in politics actually serves as a barrier to grassroots organizing and to average people getting involved in political systems. I think about also the cost of simply getting something on a ballot measure. Back in 2020, the average cost was roughly 2 million for an average citizen to get a ballot measure on the ballot, and that was via doing petitions and getting signatures. And since 2020, that cost has risen to 4 million now, over 4 million. And that's just for someone like me, just trying to get my community mobilized to try and promote better access to healthcare or more affordable housing. And so I take all of this into account of how this functions in the current system. And I agree with Kathy that a lot of us are looking to envision a better system that can give all of us more access to shaping the policies that are in place and how they're developed.
Thank you for those answers. I mean, this is all obviously not even to mention the fact that there are many anti-democratic elements and institutions baked into what we call our U.S. democratic system. If you look at the U.S. Senate, if you look at the Electoral College, so there's reason to believe that folks' dissatisfaction with what we're calling democracy may go beyond what's traditionally thought of democracy, but get to the heart of how our American democracy functions. For the next question, Nia, I'd like to actually come back to you because in this survey, no matter what background you identified with, young adults across the survey identified economic concerns nearly universally at the top of their list in terms of what matters most for the upcoming election. Nia, I know you've done organizing around economic issues, and I'm wondering if you could shed some light on that experience and what your perspective is on how to best engage folks, young people in particular, when it comes to economic issues.
Absolutely. In my experience, prior to working with the Next 100, I was working with the Homes Guarantee campaign, which is a campaign that is led and mobilized by tenants and renters across class that are seeking for a better housing system that empowers tenants with a tenant bill of rights that gives them dignified housing, affordable rents, and really basic needs that allow us to engage in society. And one of the biggest things that we learned, in addition to just how much money and politics shapes the political decisions, is that oftentimes the opposition to some of the progressive ideals or the progressive initiatives that we are working towards has a lot of power, but not a lot of identity. And what I mean by that is that they may have a lot of money, but they have this ability to distort who they are and who they're supporting politically to the degree that we don't entirely know just how much influence they have, but we know enough to know that they can block our initiatives. And it shaped a lot of the strategic organizing that went into power mapping, particularly around believing that the power may not be within our elected officials. The power may be within our agencies that can shape some of the economic issues. But I think one of the most foundational things that would have been helpful for the Homes Guarantee organizing during the time that I was there was the opportunity to have champions that are already placed in some of the agencies or even within positions of power that could push our initiatives forward. And I say champions because a lot of times when we were bringing our initiatives to elected officials or agency representatives, it was a lot of pleading our case and then hoping that we could outmaneuver an opposition that may have already made donations to their political campaigns or may have already had some kind of influence that allowed them to have an upper hand. As we seek to shape champions in the future, though, I have found that one of the things that has been most helpful with getting more organizers engaged has been being able to create I guess, a revolving door between grassroots organizing and positions of power. Seeing people like Cori Bush elected to Congress was so inspiring to many of us because we saw Cori Bush advocating for Black Lives Matter, and we saw Cori Bush advocating for maternal rights and reproductive care. And so seeing someone that was on the front lines get into a position to be a champion has inspired, I think, a lot of us to keep engaging in movements and try to get some of the organizers, the grassroots organizers, to be the champions on the inside so that they can help us. But I do think that it's the best way to engage folks when it comes to economic issues is to acknowledge their stories. It's one of the biggest things that we find among our elected officials is that they may listen, but they don't always acknowledge our stories. And it could be that they have to play the middleman between our group and whoever else is also lobbying them on the other side. But trying to find different ways to know that we are heard from our elected officials is important. And the other thing is funding the movement because it's not free and it's not cheap, and it can get exhausting or draining to grassroots groups as we look for funding against those that have an outsourced amount of money and not a lot of identity or ways to even be held accountable for how they use their power. We rely on groups like the Next 100 and others that empower young people to keep the movement growing so that we don't lose faith and don't lose our steam in our organizing.
Thank you so much for that answer, Nia. I want to shift gears just a little bit. So I know for me, when I looked at some of the response rates about civic and political engagement, I was a little unpleasantly surprised, shall we say. I was a little shocked. So just to give some examples, less than half, about 45% of young adults said they had talked with family and friends about the election. Only 12% contacted an elected official in the last year, and 13% were active in an online political group. Those felt like low numbers to me, but I'm curious, Chantal, how you digested that and what your thoughts on those numbers are. And then Dr. Cohen, I'd like to come to you just if you can put those in some historical context. I mean, is this normal? Is this abnormal? Is this historically low? Is it about what we'd expect? So Chantal, your reaction, and then Dr. Cohen, maybe some historical context for us.
Sure. I mean, I think that my reaction was a little less I'm sort of taken aback by the results. I try to kind of keep in context in my life that I am surrounded by a lot of people who are really interested in this work, who really want to do this work. But I also have a group of friends and relatives who are not at all, like, this is not the thing they want to talk about. So when I saw that it was 45%, I was like, oh, that's actually kind of higher than I thought it would be. I am based in New York City. There has been a lot happening in New York City, but I've had conversations with people in this very city who were not really aware, really in tune with what was been going on with our local government. So it just highlights to me that sometimes I think those of us in this work, in this field, feel like everyone must be talking about it. But I think in the broader landscape, it's not as common. So for me, with knowing that, I was actually it was kind of positive to me that almost half of young adults are actually talking about it. But I also understand how that is also a very low number in general. I'll turn it over to Dr. Cohen.
I think you got it right. I mean, I think there are some of us who run in circles where we talk a lot about politics. It is just kind of what we do. And then there are other folks, and it doesn't mean it's less than, where politics as we, this is what we do, is not what they do, right? In the kind of consistent sense. So do these numbers look out of line? Actually, no. We have to remember it takes a lot to involve oneself in civic engagement, meaning folks have children, They got to get dinner ready, make sure homework is done. They might engage possibly in the, a local community event. But it's kind of like voting. People have to invite you in. You have to be mobilized into civic engagement. And so it is not that surprising that the numbers are low. And we also know that the numbers tend to be lower for young people who are more mobile. It often goes up. The numbers will go up once someone is rooted somewhere. You buy a house, you start to go to community events, or you buy, a condo, or at least you're in your neighborhood for a while. So historically, not that surprising. We always have to remember that people have full lives, and that eventually, when it is a critical moment, there usually is some discussion about politics, and it might not take the form that we would talk about it, right? It could be through a program that they're streaming or something like that. So I think we're going to be okay.
Thank you for that optimism. Nia, would you like to chime in on this question at all, or should we move forward?
Yeah, I can chime in a little bit. I agree with Chantal. I think I actually thought it was a little bit higher than expected. And I'm coming from a household that raised me to believe that politics was one of the things that you should avoid talking about with people because of how polarizing it can be. And so to get to where we are now actually seems like a step forward to some degree. And that's not to say that there isn't still a lot of work that needs to be done, but I do think like the needle is moving, if ever so slightly. And I also think to Kathy's point about what those critical moments are, sometimes when I've seen people talk about politics, it comes in the form of like talking about the cost of groceries and then that leading to, well, how did we get there and what can be done about it? And it might, again, it doesn't always have the standard discussion about are we placing a vote to shape this? But I do think maybe these conversations happen in an unorthodox form that might be more centered around what people's everyday lives are, because that's some of the most easiest things to understand.
Thank you all so much for your contributions. Looks like I was the only one who was dismayed, or maybe not dismayed, but the only one who was surprised, rather. I should be more accurate in my language by those results. I would love, Dr. Cohen, to come back to you for one more question, then Tabitha, I want to get you back in, and then we're going to go to some audience questions. So, Dr. Cohen, you, of course, have conducted another survey since ours, and as you're part of the survey that we did, you looked very specifically at some of the issues that people were talking about and the issues that are motivating people to turn out for this upcoming election. Can you just talk to us about some of the actual issues that are on people's minds, and what are the things that are making people show up and want to turn out for this election?
Yeah, happy to. I mean, we I'd say about a year prior to election, we start asking a question that says something like, thinking about the upcoming elections, which issue is most important to you, right? And again, because we oversample, we can disaggregate by race. One of the kind of interesting things that we're finding is that, and I don't want to ever say independent, but across racial groups, ethnic and racial groups, the number one issue repeatedly is inflation, right? It goes back to Nia's point that people are like going to the grocery store and feeling like, wow, eggs are really high, or, my rent has gone up. And so inflation and economic issues, as we talked about earlier, are critical. Now, the second point I just want to make is that economic issues show up very differently, or can show up differently, depending on the group. So, for example, while for Latinx young folks, inflation is number one, economic growth is two, immigration is three, right? That's an important issue for them. For African Americans, inflation is number one, poverty, right? A different type of economic issue is number two. And then if you go down to five, it's racism. So I know that the kind of top line of all of our discussions tend to be, it's the economy, stupid, it's the economy, it's the economy. I want to caution us to say that the economy shows up differently in different neighborhoods, in different communities, and for different groups. I'll also say that when we think about reproductive rights, when we ask the top 5 choices for each group, reproductive rights only shows up as the number 2 issue for young white adults, and then the number 4th issue for Asian American Pacific Islander. So while the Democrats might say, and I'm saying Democrats because they've been leading this charge, that this is an election about reproductive rights, again, that really does vary for different communities, how they think about it. So yes, it's inflation, it's the economy, but those things show up differently for different communities, and other issues are important in terms of mobilizing people to vote depending on race, ethnicity, gender, and how people are just positioned and how they're living.
And just to follow up briefly, thank you for that answer. I know there's also this narrative that often says that foreign policy is not usually a motivator to turn out and vote, but you found that Palestine and Middle East issues actually are playing a significant role, at least among certain demographics. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
I can, and I think it's complicated, right? Because if you look at Asian American Pacific Islander in their top 5, number 5 is the war in Gaza. If you look at students on college campuses and largely private elite college campuses, right? Gaza is a critical issue, and rightly so. Folks will talk about the genocide that is happening. One of the things, though, for folks to kind of deal with is that when we ask about questions about Gaza and Palestine and the war in the Middle East, for significant numbers of at least our respondents, young adults, and this is a nationally representative survey, they don't have an opinion. And it's not that I believe that they haven't thought about it or been exposed, but they don't feel comfortable feeling like they have enough knowledge to express an opinion. And when we ask what's driving you in terms of the election in November, Palestine generally is not showing up, or Gaza or the war in the Middle East is not showing up in the top 3 or 5. That's not to say that it's not important. It's just to say that when you ask the question about what's motivating you to vote, and often those are thought to be kind of bread and butter issues that people can see on a daily basis in their neighborhood, the war in Gaza doesn't show up. And however you feel about that, that is the nature of data, right? It makes us deal with a reality, and then organizers can try to move people to a certain position, but we cannot assume that where we are is where everyone else is.
That is really illuminating. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Cohen. So I want to bring Tabitha back into the conversation. And this really, after Tabitha answers, is a question for all of you, but you all had a role in looking at the survey data that we got back in the summer and analyzing it and writing it. Many of you were co-authors on this report. What maybe that we haven't talked about yet, or maybe we did talk about it and it's really still on your mind, but what did the survey results leave you thinking about that you'd want to share with folks today? That'll be the last question I ask, and then I'm going to see if I can squeeze in 1 or 2 questions from the audience. So Tabitha, let's start with you, and then if anyone else on the panel feels moved to share, feel free to do so after Tabitha.
Sure. Well, Stefan, as you know, I'm new to research on young adults' views on our democracy or people's trust in government. And this survey really left me thinking about this moment that we're in, where we have stalled social mobility, where we have pretty extreme inequality and wealth concentration. And the reason that I thought about that is because, when I first got the results, I thought like the system is really not working kind of across the board. And then somewhat surprisingly to me, I think only because I'm new to this, when we looked at things like trust in government, I was somewhat surprised to see that for the federal government, for example, it's white people who had either the lowest or almost the lowest trust in government. And this just made me think about how in a moment of, limited social mobility and people feeling the stress and strain of a lack of true chances to, to advance or to have what they need, that these hierarchies that we have historically can become even more entrenched, and it can become even more difficult to see our common humanity. And it just, for me, it made me reflect on how important it is that we grapple with our true history, and how important it is that we come to have a shared understanding of how we got to this place. And we're, of course, in a moment, maybe one of many moments, where there's a lot of resistance to that and a lot of organized effort to stop us from being real about how we got here. So it left me in that place.
Thank you for those thoughts, Tabitha. Would anyone else like to chime in on something that the survey left you thinking about?
I can chime in. I think we asked a question about like what does a healthy democracy need? I'm just looking at my notes here, and equal access to education and information, equal protection under the law, housing and food affordability are all things that kind of jump to my attention. I have a background as an attorney, and I concentrated in constitutional law in law school, and that is kind of always a question for me, especially when you think about the rights that are guaranteed to us in this country, and the availability of certain things like education, the right to education, the right to be treated equally under the law, the right, in certain states there's a right to housing, how it just makes me think about sort of going back to a larger point that Dr. Cohen was making about, those things feel to me inherent in a democracy, but maybe they are more inherent in some other form of government too. And like, what do we need to create? What do we need to co-create in this country to get us closer to those things? And to Tabitha's point, we have been fighting for some of those things since the inception, right, of this country. So how, is what we have now working? Like, will those things make democracy work well? Is that the question about making democracy work well, or is the question about creating something else? So sort of just thinking about those things kind of rose to the top for me as questions as I think about the way I relate to our system of government and what I hope it does, what I want it to be in the future.
Thank you so much for sharing. Dr. Cohen and Nia, I'll let you get the last words in on that question, and then I'm going to try and squeeze in an audience question.
I'll defer to the audience question, although I said that. I'll just say that I think there is real tension, right, about what is a democracy. For some people, it's like, let's build the guardrails, make sure all the votes are counted equally and fairly. And maybe there's some form of representative government where you get some of your needs met. But the idea, right, that we would guarantee housing or equal education, I think some people will say that's either outside the boundaries of democracy, or maybe that's an outcome of a fair and free representative system. But that's not inherent to a democracy. And I think what I often see from young adults is an expansive view of an active state that provides for those things as fundamental rights in a democratic system. And I think that's the tension at times, which is, are all those things what we should be doing, and the responsibility of democratic processes?
Thanks, Nia.
I'll say some of the things that I was left thinking about after looking at the data, still heavily centered around the economic experiences and money in politics. I was thinking about other systems as well as some of the ones that are employed very much so on a local or city level, such as participatory budgeting. And I think about that because it's a way in which I found that I was able to shape how money was dispersed across my community and how resources were funded, hospitals and schools. And that was something that made me and other members of my community feel like our votes mattered, feel like our voices and our experiences mattered. But I also see that that's not a common feature in democracy as it stands. Very few places actually employ that structure or system. And so again, to Chantal's point, I definitely think we are actively sitting in this tension of whether or not democracy is, this silver bullet to get us to our freedom and justice, or if there's something better. But even as we sit in that tension, I also think that there are still actively people that try to work within the system and get their needs met, because the reality is we're living in it right now, and we're trying to make the most of the experiences that we have. But I look forward to more discussions, because I see them playing out all across social media about what could we envision beyond democracy, beyond capitalism, beyond the systems that we have in place today. And there is a lot of imagination, not just because other countries have other systems, but especially because we've come out of like a multitude of crises, from the pandemic to looking at the global wars and things that are going on, and we have actually been able to see what's going on, have documentation, video footage, pictures and images. And I think that kind of narrative or imagery adds to us being able to envision what are the alternatives? What do we want in a society that actually provides equal access to resources and equity and dignity to all those that are embedded in that society? So I think I'm left with a little bit of a lot of hope. I have a lot of hope just because I'm here, and it can be depressing if you don't. But it's not lost on me that there is so much work that needs to be done, and this system as it stands has a lot of flaws.
Wow, thank you so much. Okay, so I'm going to try something. We have very little time. I have 2 audience questions, and I'm going to ask you to pick between the 2 as your final word. You can answer one of the 2, and I'm going to try and ask you to keep your answer to about 30 seconds. So you can either pick question 1 or question 2. Hopefully not both. So the first question is about obstacles to participation, civic participation, and voting, and it's about the 2-party system. So is the 2-party system conducive to participation in democracy, or does it hamper those efforts? The 2-party system, thoughts on that? The second question is very clearly, how do you convince young people that elections matter is the question. So 2 very different questions from the audience. One is about the 2-party system. The other is, how do you convince young people that elections matter? So you can pick one or the other as your final closing thoughts. Why don't we go to Tabitha first? I'm sorry, I'm giving you the least think time. Which question would you like to answer, and try and keep it to 30 seconds, please?
Just extremely briefly, we actually know from our survey responses that many young adults don't think the 2-party system is working. I think if you look at the issues that matter to many young adults, they're just not seeing those issues advanced in a meaningful way in this system, and it's not sufficient.
Thank you, Tabitha. I'll go to Chantal next.
I again, with the 2-party system question, I think that is right. I think that we need to figure out more options for people. And we need to, I think that goes back to Nia's point about money in politics and all of that. And like, how do we actually expand the stage so that we actually have more choice, more real choice, I think, in terms of our leaders and how we shape our nation.
Thank you. Nia, going to you next.
I'm going to go with the 2-party system, but only because I don't remember the second question. But for the 2-party system question, I do think that a lot of us have come to understand that this system was created at a time when there wasn't nearly as much diversity or like empowerment of different constituencies as there is today. So it feels very outdated and archaic to the degree that things like issues of racial justice, it makes it hard to sometimes tell the difference between the 2 parties when things like racial justice are sometimes treated in a similar manner by both sides of the aisle. And so it's very limiting. But again, there is we also understand that when you vote as an independent, you don't get the same type of voting power that you would if you vote with the majority because of the way that the system is created. And so it gives us little choice as to how we can move our initiatives forward if we fall outside of the majority that agrees.
Thank you, Nia. Dr. Cohen, you got the last word.
Yes, I'm going to do elections matter. And I would say we have to think broadly about elections. So not just the national election for president, but the local and state elections. Remember the whole movement to bring in progressive prosecutors to deal with mass incarceration that were impacting communities of color. So I think we have to think of elections as part of a broader strategy of building power in communities of color. Yes, we got to mobilize. Yes, Black Lives Matter. Yes, Occupy, but also elections and the election of people like a Cori Bush. So when we think about the broad strategy of building power among often oppressed and disinvested communities, then in fact, elections is one strategy among many, but it is an important one.
Incredible. Well, thank you so much. I want to thank everyone for attending this event. We also want to acknowledge that wherever you're tuning in from, if you're in the US, you're probably located on land previously inhabited by indigenous and/or enslaved peoples. We want to give a special thanks to our speakers, Dr. Kathy Cohen, Chantal Hines, Nia Johnson, Dr. Tabitha Decker. Of course, thank you to Next 100, to Gen Forward and the Century Foundation for making this possible. A note that a recording will be made available immediately on thenext100.org. following today's event. And finally, Dr. Cohen, you almost stole my thunder with this one. Election Day is Tuesday, November 5th, 2024. Of course, more than just the president is on the ballot. Make sure you inform yourself of which people and which issues are on the ballot where you live, and go out and vote. That is it. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day.